So here's a little bit more about me. Of course, my name is Michael Collier. I'm currently on a location at a financial institute in Kansas City area, working as a software development engineer and Agile Development Coach. I'm a conference speaker and former conference co-chair for the North American Scrum Gathering 2018-2019. I think 2019 is where Leland saw me at, as well as here in Kansas City. I'm also a musician. Leland asked about recording, and I'm like, well, I don't think that's a problem. My face is everywhere. I perform in a pirate-themed musical comedy act. Here's my contact information and my alphabet soup at the bottom, if anyone's interested. There's several great development techniques we could discuss today, but and here's a few of them. Product versus project, build community culture, common understanding of product and goals, end-to-end understanding of expected test outcomes. We're going to look at some of that, and communicating up and down the organization. We're going to talk a lot about collaboration and the collaboration technique used to come to a common understanding of the product and getting good testing criteria, and how we can incorporate BDD processes to accomplish this in a scaling environment. Hopefully in a scaling environment. So, I did a quick search this morning on Agile transformation and scaling challenges. I noticed that collaboration and coordination kept coming up in all the surveys and articles. Why Agile fails in a large organization is pretty much based around communication and collaboration, and reducing overlap of responsibilities and increasing collaboration between process teams seem to be in our customer experience teams, between those teams and our actually build teams, having that conversation back and forth. Here are 4 of the most common scaling frameworks. I don't know who uses what. They all have their own flavor on scaling. They do have one thing in common, which is they have a development environment. Otherwise, why would we be scaling Agile? There are pros and cons to all of them. I'm not here to promote one over the other, that's for sure. One overwhelming problem, again, with all of the development environments is communication. We need a full understanding of what's going to be created, how we plan on implementing it, and a solid testing strategy. And since we're talking about incorporating BDD processes into scaling, we're going to concentrate more on that versus frameworks and scaling. Unless someone wants to talk about framework scaling at the end of this. Short description of, or kind of a definition of BDD. It's Agile software development process that encourages collaboration between developers, QA, and non-technical business participants in the software project. It's probably oversimplified here, but if we notice, it does encourage collaboration between all participants in the product team. We're trying to collaborate as a team, not one person pushing everything to us. When asked about BDD and where it should be used, Thomas Sandberg in his blog for Cucumber stated that his default answer was everywhere. And then he quickly clarified that was a poor answer. He said the answer he would give his friends would be in all the places where business has reasons to have opinions about the behavior. He also was quick to add that gherkin and scenarios was not the most important part. It's about creating a common understanding.
Hey, Michael, there was one question about, does BDD apply to infrastructure projects as well?
It doesn't apply well to infrastructure projects, mainly because BDD is about the overall piece you're trying to put in and the intermingling pieces of it. I've seen it used, not very well. It's more based around software and creating the proper functionality and building from the inside out on that functionality. I hope that's a good answer. If not, you can ping me again later at the end of the presentation and we'll try and clarify. BDD consists of 3 practices that must be addressed in order. We were talking about this previous to getting into this presentation. These are based around books by Gasper Nagy, I probably butchered his last name, and Seb Rose. They currently have on LeanPub Discovery, which is exploration, explore behavior using examples, which we're going to talk about one of their techniques there, and formulation, which is documenting examples was given when then. I believe they're working on automation currently. I haven't talked to them in a while. But BDD does consist of these three practices and must be addressed in order. When a team tries to formulate a story before discovering and understanding the requirements through collaboration, they tend to make the wrong things. We've had that problem. I'm sure we've all had that problem where you got to the end and they've delivered and you went, not what I really wanted. The first practice in this is a discovery. It's a structured collaborative activity that uncovers the assumptions and misunderstandings that traditionally derail software projects. This is where we create concrete examples and rules for features. This is built on Matt Wayne's example mapping. Matt Wayne is with Cucumber.io. It's a mapping concept that introduces structured conversations. We'll talk more about that in a bit. The second practice is formulation. This is where it's a creative process that turns those concrete examples created during discovery into business readable scenarios. The scenarios delivers the confidence that the team understands the business is asking for. And the third and final practice is automation. This is where we automate those scenarios and they're turned into tests and we start the coding process. The benefits of automation are many and various. The solid test suite gives a development team a safety net when time comes to make changes. That way we can make our change, make our tests to make sure that we don't break something. Tests also form a living documentation how the system is supposed to behave and readable by the business. This should illustrate what normally happens for a product team. And I would assume that we have agile practices in these places, stand-ups, collaborative planning meetings, maybe some XC processes in the teams. We seem to be really good about collaborating with our teams after we have the ordered list in place. We have iteration planning meetings where we present the team with that predetermined list. They may already include testing, some testing examples, some inputs and outputs. But without everyone's input, are we sure we've identified everything we need to create in the next increment? Do we include that development team in the upfront discussion process of making that backlog? Do we talk to the teams when we're setting a priority for the backlog? Do you think we should? I mean, I would like to pull them in a little quicker so we can get some input on those backlog items and how they should be put in the list, because we may put them in the wrong order, or we may have things that are already there that we don't understand or have already been developed. And should we pull those teams in early? As we've been talking, communication or lack thereof is a huge impediment with development processes, small or large. Good complete testing relies on good communication and collaboration to test the right thing, using the correct inputs, getting the expected outputs. Some teams rely heavily on risk-based testing, but who determines the risk? What is the highest risk? What if you miss something that's higher and fail to test it fully? Is there another issue? This is another issue with scaling, from my understanding, is if you have a team that says mine is a higher risk than yours, what does this other team say? Is it a lower risk? And how do we communicate that across our teams to make sure we're testing it correctly? By using automated testing processes implemented through BDD scenarios, we can test end to end. Not only does BDD work good at the team level where we do TDD to support overall testing strategies, it also assists in regression and implementation testing strategies. BDD itself starts with high-level testing that provide more context into the way the application should function. If we're writing code ourselves, we're going to be looking at unit tests, whereas BDD is an overall test of the functionality with unit tests based within. By starting at a higher level, business and technical teams can be sure that we're on the same page. This way we can be on the same page early. Lower level tests are then written using the TDD process. For example, suppose the product manager requests a feature expressed in a user story with acceptance criteria already. If the developer misinterprets that acceptance criteria, they could spend a week building the feature using traditional TDD practices with unit and integration tests. But if the development team doesn't have the full context of the story, they could create a lot of tests that don't support the feature. Leveraging discovery and formulation, we can hopefully avoid these issues. The product manager and the development team members meet and discuss user stories, create concrete examples of the stories in collaboration, and then these concrete examples are converted into executable specifications. There are several techniques for coming to a common understanding of the product and change requests. We're going to look at one in particular so we can go from this, which no one understands anything here, to maybe everyone gets a fluffy puppy, who knows. As I said earlier, this is based on Matt Wayne's example mapping. So it was his brainchild. He created a simple technique that can steer the conversation into breaking down any product in 30 minutes, according to him. Sometimes it takes a little more, sometimes actually less. In his blog in 2015, he sums it up this way. Before you pull a user story into development, it's crucial to have a conversation to clarify and confirm. We want to confirm the acceptance criteria before we start. Some people do this during their backlog refinement or planning poker sessions. Other teams have a specific pre-Amigos meeting, specification workshop, or discovery workshop. Whatever you call the conversation, many teams find it hard. It's unstructured, it takes too long, and gets boring. The result is they don't do it regularly or consistently, or maybe they just give up on it entirely. He goes on to say, I've discovered a simple low-tech method for making this conversation short and powerfully productive, and he called it example mapping. Example mapping itself is a structured conversation. I did drink. It's a facilitated exchange of ideas that conforms to a predefined form. In the context of a requirement workshop, a structured conversation exhibits the following properties. They're collaborative, where all attendees participate actively. We have diverse perspectives. We add a minimum of the three main areas of interest: business, development, and QA, or the three Amigos. They're short. We want regular workshops so that the learning feedback loop stays short and fast. We have a progressive focus. We capture the progress of the workshop in real time, allowing discussion to move forward very quickly. In the end, we have consensus. We agree with the examples. We agree that the examples are the work success. And one of the biggest challenges is getting the conversation started. We want to avoid implementation discussions during these sessions. This is to get the examples of the process, examples of what that user story needs. We'll get into that further here shortly. The conversation should include enough people to cover at least the development, test, and product perspectives. Encourage them to be collaborative actively. You need more bi-directional communication. Everyone does have a slightly different personality. We should establish a culture where everyone can participate, regardless of their personality. By using a method that encourages everyone to participate, talk to each other and encourage, arrange colored sticky notes, which everyone likes sticky notes. We can exercise different senses so everyone can contribute in areas where they have the higher level of expertise. We get everyone in the room to communicate. We uncover.
Michael,
Yes.
Sorry, didn't unmute quick enough. Someone on the collaborative part, they were asking, do you focus on input and outputs?
Yes. Once we get to example mapping, the actual process of example mapping, we will look at how inputs and outputs are captured or documented. So we want to know, like a calculator, we want to know if we put in 2 + 2, our output needs to be 4. We need to make sure what our inputs and outputs are going to be. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
I was going to say, I'm not following the chat, so.
Yeah, I just, whoever asked that question, make sure that that was what they, or maybe we can, when you get to example mapping, see if they have any other questions.
Okay. Yeah, I'll start back where I was. These meetings are sometimes called the 3 Amigos meetings, despite the name. The point is to not just have 3 people in the meeting. If you do that, you're back to one, essentially 3 people telling you how this piece of code or this piece of functionality should operate. They may miss things as well. So you might want to have other roles within the meeting as well. You have your business, your QA, and the devs, but you might need UX, or you might need DBA, or even security. We've all run into issues with security where we need to have their input up front before we start building what we're going to. What makes the meetings powerful is that representatives of different roles can challenge their understanding of the requirements early in the process. Even though they're all talking about the same requirement, each person is going to have their own perspective. The business, of course, will focus on the fulfillment of their role, the business side. Development will look at technical implications, and testers will challenge the feasibility of testing. Testing the feature or help identify corner cases where we all look at things differently.
Hey, Michael, on that one, we had a question come in about the mix of the skill, personality, attitude. Does it matter, or is it just get everybody in and have that conversation?
The idea is to keep it small, but we want the people in the room that can answer the question. So you're going to know up front what you're going to be discussing, which feature you're going to be looking at. Within the team itself, they can choose the person that needs to go, that would have the most knowledge of that particular item. If you need two devs to go because there's enough knowledge that needs to be shared, 2 devs could be there. But the idea is to not have 12 people in this meeting. The idea is to have 3 to 5, that mix of 3 to 5 to keep it small. You can rotate different people in and out of those. Say the next feature comes up and a different dev has more expertise, or a different QA person, that would be the person that goes to that meeting. The idea is to keep that mix going to where we have a shared understanding not only between the business and the dev team, but the dev team itself understands the product. I hope that helps. If not, again, we can revisit that. And like it says here, this meeting, whatever you call it, should be no longer than 30 minutes. Long meetings, of course, are expensive, but the idea is to keep them short so we can place them at different times during the week so different people can participate. That way we have that shared ownership. It also reduces the impact on unanswered questions. If you have a meeting on Tuesday and you have an unanswered question, you can turn that around fairly quickly before the next meeting. And we want to reach consensus in this meeting. So we know we've achieved that consensus when we agree that the output is correct. So we know that we have our examples and we have our inputs and outputs, and everything around the story is correct. The output may not be complete. We may still have some unanswered questions, but there's no hidden or private knowledge. There's not one person on the team that knows everything about this story and is not sharing. We want to make sure that we share across the team all of the knowledge. The content of all the conversations should be captured in the output. There's no need to consolidate private notes or email chains. If there are any remaining questions, the person's identified at the end of this meeting to get that answer. As we all know, software development is a learning process. The more we can learn about the problem, the easier the problem is to solve. The process can be made more efficient by having several team members with different perspectives analyzing requirements together before we start developing the software. It's much easier and cheaper for our product owner if we figure out we have a problem up front than it is when we're getting ready to implement it and realize we don't have what they need. So this is kind of a layout of the example mapping. Example mapping itself enhances the understanding of the user stories by refining them, of course, in collaboration. The product owner no longer has to create acceptance criteria on their own. The quality increases, developers and testers can estimate more confidently because we have more information up front. The rules can be used as guidance for implementation, while the examples are used as templates for test cases. So the examples would be those inputs and outputs, what we expect as our results. Writing on sticky notes and placing them on a board virtually or in person is a whole lot more fun than staring at a requirements document and writing down what you think the requirements are. It's more interactive and everyone's active state of mind. We're actually looking at something, thinking through the process versus sitting staring at a document. Basic format is that we use a yellow sticky with the user story title and a short description. The red is for questions or assumptions that need to be resolved to move forward. Blue ones are for business rules or acceptance criteria, and the green ones are for the examples. We let the requester start by writing down the user story and explaining the need for the change in the product. The requester should help the team understand the problem. The reason I say requester is because we don't necessarily want whatever you have, your product owner or that line of business representative that doesn't know about the story talking about it. We want the person that's actually questioning it or the one that knows has the most information about it. The team would then challenge the problem by asking questions. We collect all those questions by documenting them on red sticky notes. In a what if format works very well. I'll show you that here in a minute. The key here is to identify rules for every given answer for the questions on the red sticky notes when we get to identifying the rules. We extract the rules from the answers, we write them down on, again, blue sticky notes here. This basically describes the acceptance criteria of a user story. There may be instances when not all the questions can be answered by those that are present, but we identify that person, a person that can answer that, so we can move on with getting those rules. And once we've collected the important rules for the user story, you collect examples by writing them down on green sticky notes. Make sure the team talks about examples, focus on one single rule at a time, and write those down. Then we steer the discussion by asking questions. I also recommend a mini retro after to kind of look at, we want to talk through what worked well, what went well, what didn't go well. We can adjust or what we can adjust next time. I don't know if any of you know who Woody Zoll is. He's kind of the father of mob programming. This is a quote from him that really pretty much sums it up. Like everything else in life, start with what you have. Try things, modify as needed, find ways to fill in the gaps, pay attention. Always turn up the good as best you can, given the situation you're in. Find that thing that's working very well and turn that up and use more of it. So let's see how this could work with a user story for adding addition functionality to a calculator. We have the title for our user story, which is adding addition to the calculator, and our explanation. As a non-mathematician, I want the ability to add numbers on the calculator app so that I can confirm my inability to add. We might have questions. Again, here we're in a what if format. What if we need to add negative numbers? And what if we have more than 2 numbers? I'm sure there would be more red sticky notes. We can extract from those. We need to allow addition of negative numbers. Pretty much the answer to that question is that rule. Needs to allow addition more than 2 numbers. Again, pretty much the same. This is pretty simplified, but once you look at the structure, breaking down a user story can be very simple. Now we have our inputs and outputs. Like I said earlier, we have our inputs. We know what our output is going to be. We can also add in negative tests at this point. Say, let's make sure we didn't break our functionality that we had previously. And then, of course, inputs and outputs for our multiples. What this process is, it does 4 things. It helps us to understand the problem. It challenges the problem by asking questions. We identify those rules, and now we describe the situations with examples. Now, when we go back and look at that slide we had previously with the development processes, and we add in our BDD processes, notice the discovery practice or the 3 Amigos and the formulation can overlap. This is to cover those times when we start formulation and we discover we need more information, or we find a new story that wasn't covered initially. We get into formulating and we realize we need to split that story out. You might ask how this would also work in scaling. We can look at how this would fit with teams that are delivering APIs or microservices or other functionality to another team. As we previously talked, 3 Amigos doesn't mean we only have 3 in a meeting. This is representative, again, of those 3 roles, business testing and development. But with scaling, there's many times where one team is developing a piece or pieces of functionality to be consumed by other teams. In this case, it's good to have a full group of customers for their input. Now, that doesn't mean you need the full team, and you need someone to represent that team to give you those answers that you need. Including them in your 3 Amigos meeting, or including one of your teammates in their 3 Amigos meeting can accomplish this. That way you have a representation of both teams in a meeting, and you can get that input and output. What am I expecting from your API? What am I expecting from your microservice? Or what do that back and forth talk to where you get the proper functionality and everyone's satisfied, hopefully satisfied. And we were discussing earlier about TDD and BDD and how they fit together. This is a common representation, but it's a bit misleading as far as I'm concerned. It looks like we have one feature and one chunk of code to support that. That's kind of a misconception. I like this one better, mainly because I made it, but that's beside the point. The feature would include what is needed from the team providing the functionality, as well as what's being consumed. The functionality within a scenario would be represented here. In reality, each one of these TDD circles would represent an example and a rule combination that we found in the discovery process. So the example mapping can narrow us down to what piece of code we're going to add and how we would test that piece of code.
Hey, Michael, real quick on the teams, where you're talking about the 3 roles that there was a question about the architect. Is there an architect in the teams, and where do they get involved?
If you feel like you need an architect in that discovery process, have one come in. That's what I'm saying. You have your general team, your core team, but if you need an architect, bring them into that discovery process. If you need a DBA, If you need security, anyone that you feel like you have a question with, bring them into that discovery process and get that up front. You may find out at that point that you have this feature that has many different stories that are going to come out of it. And one of them may be a story architects team that's going to deliver it to you.
I may have a couple brainwaves to add when we get to the end on that.
I'm open. I can give you an answer. It may not be the right one. Now, this slide is like the previous one of the previous ones with a smaller subproduct. They still have their own independence, but the team producing the functionality now, they have input into the discovery process, both sides, back and forth, by adding one of the team members into the Amigo process, like we talked previously. But we want to be able to actually add the functionality correctly. So keeping that in mind, we have back and forth as needed. If you notice, we're also showing in this diagram that the automated testing is the full feature stack. So we're not just automating the testing of what the API or the microservice team is providing, but we're actually automating the process of consuming that and making sure that from end to end, everything works as we expect it to. By doing that, we're actually doing a vertical stack. So many times when we get into a corner, we start doing a security layer or the UI layer or the API, and we end up with technical debt. We build things that we don't necessarily need. Doing it this way, we can actually do that vertical stack, and we go to end, and we eliminate some of the technical debt of that dead code we write, just in case we happen to need that functionality later. BDD is built around feature files, and reviewing those feature files makes sure that we keep everyone on the same page as to what we're testing. We can review those feature files in a very similar way in a 3 Amigos meeting. Those meetings could be in one or all of these different places within a process, but every instance would not necessarily have the same attendees. Need an attendee there that can answer questions back between the two groups to make sure that we have the correct answers and we're adding the correct features. This process will also ensure that we have end-to-end testing of features and functionality, make sure that from the beginning to the end that we're talking and making sure that we're communicating on what should be expected. Told you it was quick. So let me skip ahead 2 slides. Here's my source information and my contact information again. I can provide that. I think Leland can get a hold of me anyway. We can go to questions now. I'll give you my best guess. You want me to go to the chat window, or we want to open up?
I think we just open it up. I think most of the chat ones, they could, if I didn't stop you in the middle, there were some I said, let's wait till the end. Okay. I think we just open it up and go from there.
Yeah, and I may have an onslaught, but I hate to dominate, but I'll try and ask them one at a time and give openings to others. So in the early days, the concept, this is test first development. It almost maps a little bit to what they were doing with what was Ward Cunningham's thing, fit and fitness, way back when. Yeah. But the idea is executable specs. I work in a government organization. They're still clinging to kind of the traditional approach, big requirements documents and so on. Mm-hmm. They still talk about the unified process phases, inception, elaboration, and so on. Of course, we're trying to get them to, okay, let's just go straight to this conversation. Now, the idea too that I have is how much are those requirements documents even needed? Because the requirements themselves and then the executable specs, you know, the Cucumber code or whatever, are just a, you know, it's a redundant representation of the same information, right?
It's a confirmation of the requirements, yes.
Except that then you're talking about yet another test, right?
Right.
Because if they could in fact become the spec, then the code, you know, the ultimate deliverable, you've got something to run against the code, but the tests and the spec are one and the same. And maybe it's an approach where we get ahead of some of these heavy documents. It's a stretch from where we are, but that's kind of the test first philosophy, right? Have the test ready before the code.
Yes, yeah, that's the whole process here. If you look at the discovery and the formulation, discovery itself, you've pretty much already figured out what you're going to build.
Right.
Formulation is building the test and the code. Okay. So we're going to build, you're talking about Cucumber, your formulation is looking at the given, when, then, and our feature files and building that out in Cucumber itself, and then coding back to that.
Okay. And yeah, I'm just laying the groundwork maybe for my next questions. So when you bring this approach to teams, I see sticky notes and so on, but of course, in the large enterprises, chances are we're working out of tools. So do you see the essentially the feature description, the feature file, basically filling out in the acceptance criteria field, something like that? Or do you more like to see them just point to the source code for the test? Because ultimately we're gonna, at least if we're automating, and I kind of drive toward, okay, at least in the work management tool, be it Jira version 1 or whatever, let's get the happy path into that work management record, the story, whatever. Is that how you tend to approach it when there are tools around?
Yes and no.
Okay.
I mean, the feature files themselves will document most of what you're wanting to do. Right. And you're talking about happy path itself. The feature files themselves aren't just a happy path.
Yeah, and now you're going where I was going to go next, because to me the difference between what happens in TDD and unit tests versus BDD and more functional tests is the number and the focus of the effort. That developers with TDD are going to be looking at very granular unit testing, even to the point of wringing out things like error handling, mocking out subsystems that you won't necessarily have access to. You know, you see the testing pyramid, unit tests should outnumber functional tests, right? Which then outnumber the end-to-end tests. The end-to-end and functional tests are also longer running, but you can incorporate the unit tests into your build verification or your smoke test, because they run quick. And that's the distinction I tend to make between, you know, the TDD and BDD, even though you might be able to overlap some of what's going on.
BDD is more at that integration end-to-end test. And that's kind of what I'm trying to emphasize here with this is, if you look at the automation, that's your BDD test. And you're testing from, with Cucumber, you can test from the UI and run things all the way back to the end.
Yeah.
BDD are those pieces in between that build up to that overall test.
Yeah, and it's, I'm just thinking in terms of, it's fewer tests as you go up the pyramid and the tests get more fragile. But ideally, you're not loosing upon the automation a bunch of things, you know, a bunch of code that doesn't necessarily even have the quality you want yet, you know, from a code-based perspective.
No, it's not in this particular presentation, but if you look at BDD as an overall process,
Mhm.
you build a broken test. You build it identically to the way you would TDD. You build a broken automated test. You look at that broken automated test and say, what functionality do I need to fulfill that? And you build that functionality in a TDD manner to fulfill the overall BDD broken test until you fulfill that
Yeah,
test and it works.
You're still talking very functional. I'm talking about things like what happens when you run out of database connections or get a null pointer exception, things that you would simulate as early as possible to verify the code base health, but you don't necessarily drag the whole team into that conversation. That it's really kind of developer concern. You may even have what to call it, NFRs around, how well we do error handling, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and that goes back to the conversation about the architect. That may be a discussion that you have with looking at your overall feature, saying, okay, what if that's a what if question? What if we run out of database connections?
Right.
Well, discussion with an architect can tell you this is what you need to architect into your actual functionality.
Yeah,
and I understand where you're going there. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's the next concern. This may be my last.
Maybe.
Yeah. Well. So it didn't originate with SAFe at all, and it applies in systems at scale generally anyway. Distributed systems don't just act, as the monolithic beast we think they will be. The chaos engineering concept. What happens when things time out, et cetera, when someone trips over the power cord at the data center. Distributed systems fail in interesting ways. What do you call it? Latency is not zero. Bandwidth is not infinite. Things like that.
Right.
I think I'd almost add security to some of these concerns. So yeah, here is where the conversation, perhaps with the architects and other compliance people, might come up. And I think it gets challenging if we try to include all of these concerns in this approach. Functional, though, absolutely. I love BDD, so don't get me wrong.
Right. One of the cautions with BDD is with this process with example mapping is one of the prerequisites is getting the right people in the room. If you get into the discussion of a feature and you realize that, well, maybe you need some upfront discussion with an architect, or you need to figure out how you're going to deal with timeouts and things like that, that's probably time to end that conversation and either move on to a different user story or just disband that particular meeting and get those people in a room.
Yeah.
Because at this point you're going to try and call them into a room and then it's a mess. So maybe that's looking at example mapping as we're looking at it. That's something that drives out of that. You're asked these questions, you have these assumptions. Well, now you've asked that question. Now maybe we need to break out of this meeting and really get a good answer to that question versus, the people in the room can throw spaghetti on the wall, but it may not be the right answer.
Yeah. Some of the, I'll say this and then I'll shut up. Some of our big concerns these days seem to wrap around security, which it's a little bit hard to anticipate how the system will be attacked. So we end up having penetration tests and things like that, which probably don't fit well under the umbrella. But
that goes back to a working agreement with your team or your definition of done. If we back to straight Agile.
Most of this stuff actually happens downstream. We have checklists say here are good practices, OWASP top 10 things to observe, and at the same time, the government weighs in an awful lot of interesting ways as it gets downstream.
Yeah, I've worked for the government before, and I've had some friends that work for the government. I'm sorry it took you 20 documents to change that period that was missing in that text.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to shut up now. Thanks.
Thank you.
Anyone else have any questions?